Okay, I believe we're live at Erskine Parish Church. This is EPC Conversations, episode number 12, albeit in a slightly different format because we're having a go at actually doing it live. Um, Tonight, my guest is a Mr. Andrew Rooney. He is the minister of Kirkmuirhill Parish Church in Lanarkshire. And I asked Andrew to join me for a conversation because he was ordained not that long before me. He was ordained about a year before. And so, what I thought would be at least fairly interesting tonight to discuss on this is a lot of folks in my congregation have been saying to me, what's this? This is really, must be really odd for you being a relatively new minister and you've got to do it in this situation. So, firstly, Andrew, welcome. And let's just kick it off since it is live and it is a conversation. How are you getting on? How have you found the pandemic as a newish minister?
Different. I think it's been a really strange 10 months, 11 months. It's been a bizarre time for anyone. But a lot of the things that ministers do, it relies on face to face. It relies on face to face, person to person contact. So, preaching on a Sunday would normally be in front of a congregation. Involved with different schools would normally be face to face. Assemblies, even in our pastoral care, that would normally be very much face to face, and all of that has moved, if not online, to phone. So that's been the strangest part of this for me. It's been the thing that I've had to get my head round fairly quickly. When we all locked down for the first time in March, of actually just getting to that point where you felt as though you were keeping in contact with folk, and making sure you were keeping folks engaged with everything that's going on in the life of the church. So it's been incredibly different and quite strange, I suppose.
What about tell us a bit about your parish in Kirkmuirhill Parish Church. You're not a million miles away from us in Erskine, but I'd imagine it's quite different. Tell us a bit about the parish and the situation that you're in there.
Yeah, so Kirkmuirhill, I'm the minister of Kirkmuirhill Parish Church. The parish takes in the village of Kirkmuirhill, takes in Blackwood, takes in a wee place called Bent, and Auchenheath and Boghead. We have a variety of different professions within the church family. So we've got some farmers. We're semi-rural in some respects. Just we're really close to the Clyde Valley, so we've got quite a lot of. We've got some folks who are involved in farming, but equally we've got folks who are involved in the building trade, who are involved. So we've got a couple of police officers. We've got a whole host of teachers involved in the church as well. So we make up we're quite a diverse congregation, and it's quite a diverse parish because of that as well. So we've got a lot of people who, just because of where we are, so we sit just outside Lesmahago, so we are kind of 10 minutes to Hamilton, half an hour to the city centre of Glasgow. We're really not that far from a motorway. So a lot of people who live here do so because it's a great place to commute from. But we also have folks who have been kind of born and bred in the villages and have been here their whole life, work locally, whether that's on farms or Lesmahago or Hamilton. And so yeah, so we've got that's the kind of makeup of the parish is we've got folks who commute and we've got folks who work where they live, which I imagine is fairly similar for Erskine as well, David.
Yeah, certainly there's a good amount of that sort of commuter basis. Although not the semi-rural thing is quite different. Now this is obviously your first charge as well as mine. So what, if you like, did you always think you would end up in a place like Kirkmuirhill? What was your journey to being called there and accepting the sense of call to
Yeah.
where you are right now?
Um, so, so no, I had no idea where God was going to call me at all. I just said, take me wherever you're going to lead me, and we'll see what happens. Kirkmuirhill's had an interesting past history in the last kind of 10, 15 years. So Before I came, the church actually split, and half the congregation left and half stayed. They then went through a vacancy of almost 6 years before, in fact, if not longer, before I came. And actually, it was a conversation with a minister in the Free Church, who had kind of grown up in Kirkmuirhill Parish Church, and he'd said he came to. So I did my probation at Christland Parish Church, and he came to kind of help. He was taking a funeral with Mark Malcolm, who's the minister at Christland, and I was talking away to him. I knew him from different things, and he was saying, "So how are you getting on?" And this was back in the kind of September before I actually became minister in the March, and at that point I was in the midst of applying for somewhere else, and he said to me, "Look, I think you should consider Kirkmuirhill," and I was like, a huge legacy there left by previous ministers. I mean, a first charge where there's been quite a dramatic split. It's not something that I would think would be naturally, I suppose, where I was where God might be calling me. And I kind of ignored them, I guess. And I went home from the funeral, and my wife came in from work, and I said to my wife, Steph, I think we should look at a parish profile. And she said, okay, let's look at a parish profile. We've not done that in a while. So looked at the parish profile for Kirkmuirhill, and there was just something about it that had a huge draw. Like they love God's word, and they still do. There are people who are passionate about praying, and they're passionate about engaging with their community. And one of the things that they'd kept going throughout the split and throughout the kind of vacancy was their summer holiday club, which normally gets about 100 kids every single day. So there was a huge potential there. And I was like, okay, let's maybe think about it, but we're going to see what happens with this other church we've applied for. So that was a Friday. And then on the Sunday, I went to Christ, and Mark Malcolm hands me a letter, and he said, oh, this arrived for you. And it was a letter from Kirkmuirhill Parish Church Vacancy Committee to say, we'd love to come and have a chat with you about our vacancy. And I got back to them and said, look, I'm in the midst of actually, I've submitted an application elsewhere. I'm waiting to hear back from that. And at that point, so about 2 weeks passed, and I knew Kirkmuirhill's vacancy committee were going here, there, and everywhere to interview different ministers. And I heard back from the other church to say that they decided to go with someone else. And I'd always said, as part of the kind of discernment process for me, you know, if God says no, then that's an answer in itself. So God said no, and I thought, right, we're going to take a couple of weeks to actually think about this. And we did. So I took a week just to not even look at applications or anything like that. And after a week, got in touch with Kirkmuirhill Parish Church, and my probation ended on the 30th of September. And I asked them if they would wanted to come and hear me on a Sunday. And the only Sunday that I had in the diary at that point was something like the 28th. So they came to hear me at Christland, and we had a conversation. I was quite grateful when they came, because there was only about 7 of them there, and I was like, right, that's great. You've only sent half your nominating committee, so that's not a huge number. That's fine. And then they emailed that day to say, unfortunately, 2 of our nominating committee couldn't be here, so we just brought everyone else. And I was a bit like, okay, so you've literally brought your whole nominating committee. That's great. Steph and I came to visit. We had a look around the church, had a look around the parish, spoke to a couple of people, and I was still in that process of saying, is this from God? Is this where I'm being called? And so I actually went to see one of my other supervisors that I'd done a placement with, Alistair Duncan at St George's Tron. And I spoke to Alistair, made a good conversation about it. And I came out and I was walking back up to Buchanan Galleries. I said, God, you need to show up here, because I have no idea if I'm hearing this right. So if you could send any sort of sign, that'd be great. And as I'm walking to my car, the Free Church minister who'd mentioned it to me 3 or 4 weeks before came walking towards me. And he said, oh, it's good to see you. Where have you been? I said, I was actually just talking to a minister about potentially applying to Kirkmuirhill. And he just gave me this huge hug and went, I'm delighted to hear that, and then walked off. And at that point, I was like, right, God, now you're just showing off. So at that stage, I knew this is probably where we're going to end up. It took a while just to kind of work through they were in the process of buying a new manse, so that took a wee bit longer than expected, and then eventually was ordained in the March. So from about the kind of September to March, so 6 months, God just said, no, this is where you're supposed to be, and this is what it's going to look like, and off you go. So and ended up at Kirkmuirhill.
Great. I love your story of your first charge, because I've heard it before, obviously, kind of offline, off the record. It's a great example of sort of you as a kind of the human being in the situation, not really knowing where you're going, but completely throwing yourself on trusting God. And then it's a great example as well of God just so speaking to you, even when you're not sure where you're meant to be headed, and you relaxing into his guidance, which is just great, man. So God guided you to Kirkmuirhill. You came there. I have to say that I don't think it is every candidate that could take on a church that's recently had a difficult split. I remember when I was trying to figure out congregations, speaking to older mentors soon, maybe avoid that one, they've had a split. I have to say, though, Andrew, I'm not surprised that God called you to somewhere like that, because I would say, and I don't mind saying on YouTube, you've always struck me as a guy that I liked, because you don't take yourself too seriously, but you take God very seriously. And I think that's the kind of temperament I would imagine you probably need to take up a new ministry somewhere like that, and really try and bring a new direction in a sense of going forward with God. So how did that work then from day one when you got there on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, even just going back to my interview with the nominating committee at Kirkmuirhill, they didn't want to interview me in Kirkmuirhill because they didn't want to kind of let on that they were interviewing someone. So they actually came to Christen to interview me. So it meant I set up the room. Do you know, it was the most relaxed interview I'd ever had in my life. And they asked me at the start, one of the questions they asked was, what would be your kind of 5-year vision for Kirkmuirhill? And I turned to them and said, I don't know. Do you know, I don't believe in actually coming with a ready-made vision. I think it's about listening to the people who are already there, engaging with the community. I said the one thing I'll do 2 things when I'm there as minister, and the first is I'll love God, and the second is I'll love people. And I hope I've stuck to that. I'm sure if folks from Kirkmuirhill are watching, David, they can probably comment better than I can. And that's what I tried to do. So one of the first things I did when I was ordained on a Tuesday night. By the Thursday, I'd popped into the 2 local primary schools, went in with a box of donuts and just said, hello, I'm the new parish minister. If there's anything I can do to help, I'd love to be able to do that. And have now got a great working relationship with both local primaries. The high school in Lesmahagow hadn't had a chaplaincy, hadn't had a chaplain for a number of years. There'd been a bit of a fallout there. And so one of the things that Presbytery had said to me was, if you could try and open that door and kind of push that door just to see what happens, that'd be great. But actually, the head teacher from Lesmahagow High had already been in touch because he'd worked alongside my mum, who's a head teacher in Motherwell. So because of that connection, it was an open door, and it was like, how can you come and help do chaplaincy for us, Andrew? So, and it was just that then just kind of became how I did ministry. So it was just about talking to people and just getting people, kind of bringing people alongside me, and just making sure that folks were involved, and keeping things going that had always been there. So one of the huge privileges of my first year was that first holiday club that we had, because you're suddenly being met with a number of young people who from the primary school, and that was great, and it meant that I got to know all these young people. We had a kind of evening holiday club for teenagers as well, and we were getting about 30 teenagers through the door. We ended up having to hire a coach on the Friday night to actually take us all bowling, because there was so many teenagers that wanted to come bowling with the church. Now, there's just part of me that just kind of goes, right, well, that's not from me, that's definitely from God. And that's really how, and it wasn't about dwelling on the history and obviously knowing the history, but actually just saying, look, what do we want to be known for going forward? You can look back all you want, you can look back on previous ministries and give thanks for a lot of the things that have happened. But equally, we need to now actually get to that stage where we say, well, what do we want to be known for moving forward? And that's been my kind of focus for the last couple of years, especially.
I was just laughing to myself when you were talking. I didn't know that you said that to the folks at the nominating committee, because I was thinking back to my own, and probably some of the folks from the nominating committee be watching. This is primarily for our church in terms of an audience. But I gave a very similar answer. I asked, what are you going to do in terms of what's your plan and vision? And I said something similar to you in that I wanted to do a bit of a listening exercise, find out what the community's made of, and do that and see what the needs are before we look to, respond to them left, right, and center. But big priority was just getting on with the job of the word and the sacraments and loving people. But the other thing that I think is so amusing for you and me is, in terms of having had a grand vision, given what's happened since 2020, I mean, we would have all had to have been torn up anyway. So March comes, and I think you've been ordained, you've been a minister about a year when the pandemic hits. Talk us through how you received the news and what you started thinking as minister, and a fairly new minister, what that was going to mean and how it was going to affect, and how are you going to handle this as a church?
Yeah, so we're part of Lanarkshire Presbytery. We're a fairly small presbytery. So our presbytery clerk was keeping us in touch with everything that was going on and kind of decisions that were, I think. But so we had the last church service we had in the building before kind of the first lockdown was on the 15th of March, and we'd opened the balcony. We were asking people to sanitize their hands on entry. And I still vividly remember one of our members saying to me, "Oh, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time." And there was part of me thinking, actually, it might not be 2 weeks, but it's probably not going to be that long. Maybe a month and a half. But we'll be back for summer, And that was, we'll be back in time for holiday club. We'll be back in time for the schools finishing, and that was my line of thinking. And then over the course of that week, so on the Monday, you could tell it was getting more serious. And then on the Tuesday, there were the rumours of the schools closing. And as soon as that kind of came out, you were a bit like, right, this is where the church is now, will probably close as well. And that then came on the Wednesday. And at that point, it was just a case of, right, how do we keep in touch with folk? How do we actually continue to connect with people? What does that look like? How do you preach the word in this season? And when none of us have been trained for that. The last kind of pandemic that hit the West was the Spanish flu. So it's not as though we're going through training with ministers who were alive in those times and who can say to us, well, actually, this is what we did. It was completely, it was a case of, right, what's everyone else doing and how much of that can we replicate? Do we replicate it all? And I made the decision quite early on not to. And actually, what does it look like to continue to preach in this climate? What does it look like to pray in this climate? What does it look like to reach out to your community in this current climate as well? So that was kind of what the conversations that I had to have with myself and with the Kirk session as well, just to say, look, how do we do this? And I always said to my Kirk sessions, we're going to have to make decisions in a very different way just now. We're going to have to make them quickly. And I kind of went with, if I get it wrong, I'll apologise. But we're going to have to make these decisions fairly soon. And so we moved everything online. We moved our first of all, we moved our morning service online. We had a few evening services over the course of the summer, and we moved our prayer online. That went to kind of Facebook Messenger group. We even moved and then from there we kind of then diversified. So with the services, we started putting the sermons on the website. We started putting sermons on a phone line that people could phone to listen to. And I think it was just at the start of all, it felt like an exponential learning curve, because there's no other way to describe it. It was a case of you had to go about 200 miles an hour for that first 2 months just to get everything set up and on the go. And that's how it felt for most of March and part of April, was just get going. And and make decisions and move forward as a church. And that's really what we did.
And what about for ministry during it? What have you, as someone who's figuring out, finding your feet and learning how to be a minister, like any of us do, by getting experience, what have you found especially challenging about this whole phase and having to do it in the midst of a pandemic?
I think one of the most challenging things has been pastoral care. Not actually being able to go and visit folk who are seriously unwell, whether that's in hospital or at home. And then obviously when it comes to planning funerals, obviously that was then done over the phone or over Zoom, which felt really strange. Normally I'm quite happy to go and visit a family. So the way I kind of organise a funeral, I'll go and visit the family just to introduce myself. I'll then go back a few days later to hear some stories about the person that's passed away. And normally that's one of these things where I say to the family, bring as many folk as you like, and I'll just sit and write on a notebook for an hour, 2 hours, however long it takes. And then I normally go and see them after the funeral as well. So obviously that all stopped, and suddenly you're having to do all this by phone. You can normally, I consider myself quite a good reader of people. So you can normally tell what this story is making someone feel, so you can have a conversation, you can tease out a little bit more about someone in that way. You can't do that on the phone, and that, I think that was the hardest part. And when the restrictions came in on numbers, on how many family could actually be there, that was really then hard to see families react to that, and actually, what does this look like for us? Because we are a village community, David. We're known as Kirkmuirhill Village, Blackwood Village. So some of the folk who have passed away in these last few months have been incredibly well known by the community. And if it was a service taking place in the church, it'd be full. There wouldn't be a seat in the house. Whereas we've had to kind of adapt to that. So I think that's been the most difficult. Has been, how do you pastorally care for people when you can't go and see them face to face?
Yeah, and the crude reality is that an enormous amount of the kind of people I think God draws and calls to this kind of work is people who actually have that sense of receptiveness to other people, their emotions, their needs, wanting to be able to serve them at a time of need and crisis. And I think I resonate with a lot of what you said, that certainly the inability to do that, the fact that you live in a strange world where it's not actually safe to do that in one way, has been really weird. What about in terms of actually delivering, communicating, preaching? How have you found that, either doing it to a camera or doing it to a very small room or hardly any people? And how have you found it, and how would you contrast it with what you were used to?
So the first few services we did online, I actually recorded a bit like this. So it was me sitting at my desk with a front-facing camera. Probably about a month in, I started using two iPads. So an iPad to preach from and an iPad to film, and actually changed the location to our front room, so not in the study. First few weeks were just bizarre because you're just preaching. I mean, I was literally preaching to a window, and that way there would be sometimes the doorbell would go and like the phone would ring, and I mean, my most hilarious moment was when the president of our guild was walking past with her granddaughter, and I'm in the midst of recording a sermon, so I'm halfway through, and that way I'm looking at it going, I can't really pause at this point because it's not a natural pause point. So I just kept going, but all I could see out the corner of my eye were the president of the guild and her granddaughter just both standing at the door, at the wall of the house, just going, "Hi!" And I was like, I can't even wave back because that's just going to look really, really strange. So that was really bizarre because normally, I mean, it's changed how I preach. So before this all kind of started, I'd been very much full script, so I'd have everything written down. But I realised you can't have a full script when you're talking to camera. So I suddenly became kind of bullet pointed preaching, which has meant some sermons have been much longer than they would normally be, because when you're on bullet points, if a story comes to your head, you're going to tell it. Whereas if you're full script, you know there's no room in there for another story, or you lose your place. For me, you lose the interaction with people. So when you're preaching to a congregation, when you're all in the same room, you can actually see what it is that folks are struggling with, especially if you bring up a certain topic, or even sing a certain hymn that just brings back a memory that's upsetting for them. You can then kind of actually follow up on that. When you're preaching to a camera that's going online, you don't get to see that. You don't get to see how people are reacting or interacting with what you're saying. I think that's probably been the trickiest part of kind of learning to preach to camera. And even we had a few services before Christmas that were in person, but it still felt the same as what it had for the last few months, because folks were now wearing face masks, so you still couldn't actually tell how people were reacting, because normally it's facial expressions. Normally if someone smiles at something, then you kind of move from that, and you just couldn't do that in that time. So it's been a strange process, not preaching to people, but actually preaching to a window, which has felt quite strange. But it's I heard right quite near the start of this, when we were talking about, well, we're in unprecedented times. I was actually a minister who I was listening to, who said, we are in unprecedented times, but we're in unrelenting times, because that's exactly how it feels. It's just a constant feeling of change. So every time there came an announcement from the Scottish Government, it felt as though there was more change coming. Every time something else happened, you felt as though you were kind of reacting as opposed to acting. So it felt unrelenting in that first kind of 6 months of just keep going. And I think in terms of preaching, I really missed actually having people sitting in front of me to listen to a service, to actually then interact with at the end of a service. So that was strange and quite bizarre.
And what about that? I relate to nearly all of what you said, and I think the worst of that is that if you really you don't get into it, and you don't feel God's called you just to preach for the sake of doing it. You believe you're doing it to real people, real souls that will really go to eternity, and you've got that sense of gravity, and that weighs on you. And but it helps when you can see those people. Whereas I think one of the hardest things for me has been that feeling of, this could just be going out into the camera and then falling right onto the ground. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's exploding like fire in people's hearts, but I've got no idea. I wouldn't know the difference. And that's, I think, probably one of the hardest parts for me. So I resonate with all of that. But what about in terms of, that's really interesting, that not just is this all new, but it's constantly new, and you never get a break from this pandemic, or we haven't for a year. Tell me how that's been for you in terms of your own energy levels and motivation, and the fact that you have a lot of responsibility and you've got to try and lead, but you're a human being as well. What's that been like for you?
So in the first lockdown, we had someone from the community call a meeting. She's involved in resiliency planning for one of the big energy companies, and she said, we need to be really careful how we do this, because at that point they were running low on supermarkets on toilet paper and pasta. When we had that massive run on two strange things to have a massive run on, but off we go. So she said, look, I think we need to respond to this in some way. So at that point I said, look, come and use our building. Whatever you need, we'll provide. If it's a space, not an issue. So on the back of that, we ended up setting up a kind of a group of call handlers who were voted on Monday through Friday, 10 till 12, so that if folks were having to shield or self-isolate or anything like that, we had a team of runners that we could call on to actually come and help with that, and go shopping for them at the different supermarkets we've got in the area. On the back of that, we also set up a kind of mini food bank, so that we actually had stock ourselves, so that if someone phoned and it was an emergency kind of food bank call, that they don't actually have any money, they can't get out to the shops, can they get anything? So we had things coming in like fresh fruit and veg from local farms, and we had bread come, so we knew someone that was working for Warburton's at that point, and they delivered a whole host of bread to us. We had shelves full of tins and kind of dried goods and just about everything else. But equally, we were aware that actually the thing that's going to affect people most in this is that idea of loneliness, almost boredom. So on the back of that, the Resilience Group had a kind of library set up. We had an environmental project that kids could enter, so that you could actually have, and they've actually just come down. It was signs encouraging people to pick up their litter. We had a whole host of kind of craft things that went out, so like knitting stuff went out, and we had people who became a kind of comfort caller. So if someone was particularly on their own, and we also had there was things going on during the evenings as well. So that was a team of 6 of us that kind of helped to get that off the ground, and it was a huge privilege to be a part of that. But so this all kicked off in March, and I think I got to about August and just realised how tired I was, and suddenly went, I don't feel as though I've stopped, because even so my day off's always a Friday, and even being part of the Resilience Group, I always took a Friday off from call handling. But there was always things to be doing. There was always phone calls and people you had to catch up with, and just people to get in touch with, just to see how they were doing. And it got to about August, and I suddenly realised that actually I was getting pretty tired and pretty exhausted with everything that was going on, because it just felt as though, as I said, it just felt unrelenting. It was just it felt as though it had been a slog, and there wasn't too much of an end in sight, I suppose. And that was kind of how I was feeling. That was kind of where my energy levels were at, and I could tell that. I could pinpoint the points where I was getting annoyed at the stupidest of things, and the smallest of things was enough just to make me go, "Oh, what's going on here? This is ridiculous." And that's when I know that the stress levels have built to a certain level that something has to give. So on the back of that, I started the Couch to 5K, and my wife was like, "Right, let's go and do Couch to 5K," and I was like, "This is a terrible idea, but off we go and we'll give it a shot." And we did that in the summer, which was great, and it was just really helpful, because suddenly you're out for, it's half an hour. It's not as though you're away for kind of like 4 hours playing a game of golf. Half an hour, and that was enough just to kind of get my head right out of ministry, right out of church stuff. And on the back of that, we joined the gym, because actually I realised that I don't like running in the rain or the wind. I'm very much a fair weather runner, so when it was the summer, it was great because it was nice. It wasn't too warm. It was okay. And then suddenly August came and it started raining, and I was a bit more like, don't know if I'm as much of a fan of this running malarkey in this weather as I was kind of back in the summer. So we joined a gym, and then I keep saying that I joined a gym and then they closed them, which is kind of true. I think we were a member of a gym for about a week before they shut them down. So, but it was that kind of thing. It was just suddenly realising that actually I hadn't been sleeping properly, hadn't been exercising at all. I hadn't been eating properly either. I'd just been kind of snacking throughout the day and just picking up random, like going to a shop and picking up a bar of chocolate and thinking that would be lunch. It was things like that, just going, right, okay, this needs to stop. So I did that. I joined the gym, and thankfully my wife and I were able to get away on holiday in the midst of, in between kind of lockdowns. So we ended up going down to Devon for just over a week. Took the dog with us, and it was just a case of kind of a week long of walking in the middle of Devon, and just reading a book, and that's kind of, and because I knew where I was nearly hitting breaking point, I now know before that comes. I've almost kind of got a flood warning system now built in that tells me when I'm about to become too stressed, that I know when to kind of stop. So yeah. So I think it was just one of these. It was just learning to actually, there's it was about learning what does it mean to have a rhythm of grace in life, and not just to show to other people, but to actually show to yourself, and that became quite important for me.
Yeah. So what's your kind of plans or hopes
or aspirations now? Because it sounds like in some ways, although this has been hard, you've put it to enormously good use. You've managed to establish rhythm in lots of ways, in ways I'm pretty envious of. I couldn't do, I haven't even been able to dream of establishing anything like that rhythm or discipline, given the plates I'm spinning. But what are you hoping for this year, if anything at all?
So interestingly, just before all kind of lockdown kind of came and hit us all like a ton of bricks, I became a trustee for 24/7 Prayer Scotland. So that probably helped my. It was helpful to actually be involved in something that took my mind off parish ministry as well, and actually gave me a much wider focus. So that was really helpful. And equally on the back of that, Steph and I actually went to the 24/7 Prayer Conference, which was done online, and that was in October, and that felt like quite a significant moment for me, because I suddenly realised that for the first time since the March, I'd spent a whole weekend not thinking about COVID, and suddenly realised actually that was incredibly helpful. So for me, that was a kind of defining moment. Looking ahead, I think looking ahead depends a lot on what comes next. I would love to plan for Easter services in the church. I'd love to start planning for a summer holiday club, but a lot of that will depend on what the restrictions are, how the vaccine rollout is continuing to go. One of the things we're looking at doing as a church family is actually running Alpha online for the church family, actually, just to give us all. This has been a really tough year. It's been a really difficult year. So actually, how do we grow our own faith in the midst of this, and what does that look like? So we're gonna do Alpha together as a church family. We've got some money from Presbytery sitting for to be used as a kind of mission project going ahead. So we're looking at actually what does it look like when we can all gather again to have almost like a weekend of celebration is my kind of working title. Who knows when that'll be, but actually let's move forward with that and look to what's coming. I've said this a few times just in services and to different folk. Christians have an opportunity in this. In the midst of a world, in the midst of a country, a society that's actually so incredibly afraid about what comes next, a society that's not sure of what life will look like, a society that actually is looking at the world around it and going, what on earth is happening here? We might not know what the future holds, but we know the one who holds our future. And we've got this really great opportunity to be the most hopeful person in a room, because of who our faith is. Our faith's not built on a political system. It's not built on a political movement. It's not built on a political party or at all. It's built on Christ, and there's a reason that Christ is described as a cornerstone and anchor. It's because he has weight. It's because he's able. And I think actually being able to say we're going to commit ourselves into God's hands at this time because his hands are stronger than our own. And actually say, well, what does this look like, God? What does it look like to seek you in 2021? What does it look like to seek you this year moving forward? And how do we do that?
Mate, that sounds like a perfect way to round it up. I might just steal that last little clip instead of my sermon on Sunday. I don't know if I could say anything any better myself. That's absolutely perfect thoughts and sentiment, I think, to try and approach the rest of the year with, for all of us who are people of faith living through this. Let me just ask you, for people who are watching in our church and who are praying people, how can we pray for you and for Kirkmuirhill Parish Church?
You could pray for our Alpha that we're looking to do. We're looking to do a messy church at home for Easter. So you could be praying for that. We've got some of our church family who are unwell at the moment, and that hits particularly hard because I obviously can't go and see them. So we've got a few folk in hospital or just home from hospital. And I'm just aware of how many people within our church family who who are exhausted. Do you know, we've, as I said at the start, we've got a number of teachers who make up our church family who are tired because, I mean, we thought ministry had been unrelenting. I think education has been more so. We've got a number of people who are involved in emergency services. We've got some folks who are involved in the building trade, and life just looks quite different for them right now, quite stressful. So you could, I just value prayer for people really, just to pray for that we'd keep the main thing. I think it's so easy just now to become focused on everything else that's going on, and we do, and I think it's so easy to actually just watch the news every day and weep, and we do, but we do so as a people of prayer and as a people of faith and as a people of hope. So I think that would be our values. Do you know, this coming Sunday I'm preaching on the greatest commandment that Jesus gives in Mark's Gospel, and actually that's what I would love to see for not just the church here in Kirkmuirhill, but actually the church across Scotland. You know, that would be known for our love for God first and foremost, that would be known for our relationship with Him, but on the back of that, we'd actually then be known for our love for other people. So I think that would be my big prayer for Kirkmuirhill, would be that we would actually be a church that recognises that and exhibits that in everything that we do.
That's great, man. Well, it certainly sounds like you're headed in that direction anyway. So, Andrew, I'm very grateful for you joining me on this tonight. I know it's been interesting for myself, but I'm very confident it's been interesting for many more, just to hear actually the minute details of how you've dealt with the challenges of relatively new ministry, with all that we've been through, but also the real optimism and the note of hope and faith that you have, which we could all do with a shot of. So thanks very much, mate. It's been great.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. I'm just gonna end the stream. Good night, folks. God bless.